One of the most intriguing areas in our Fall Institute in the criminal justice section was a conversation about things that prosecutors are doing that maybe people don't even realize they are doing. And one of those surprising areas is the use of conviction integrity units. Literally, prosecutors seeking out cases to review to ensure that convictions proper and just. These are not appellate units. Conviction integrity units seek to support, do not seek to support and defend convictions as appellate units do. They seek to question convictions in order to ensure that justice was done. One of the key statements that was made in one of our panelists last fall in revolving around criminal justice reform is that a prosecutor's duty to seek justice never ends, even after conviction. So that's why we're here. We've assembled an amazing staff, prosecutors from around the country, to help explain what conviction integrity units are and the challenges that each of us have as we expand our area of work as prosecutors. So I want to take a little bit of an opportunity to welcome you to this and hope that you enjoy what we have to offer. Our panelists today come from different areas of the country with different perspectives. And let me just say, I asked for short bios, and our first panelist, he sent me a fairly lengthy, long biography that is about 10 paragraphs long. And I thought to myself, well, he didn't listen very well. But Mark Dupree, the district attorney of Wyandotte County in Kansas.
Read the last paragraph. We're good.
And I will actually read that because after I read it, I realized I think this may actually be the short bio. I will, start referring to him essentially as Superman because of the things that he has done and the things that he continues to do. Mark is a new district attorney. He was elected in 2016 and took office in January 2017 for Wyandotte County. And it is amazing to see the work that he has done in such a short period of time. And one of the things that really is key when you look at what he does is the fact that his focus is on equitably charging and prosecuting crime, to be proactive in attacking violent crime, and look at how his office can affect the standard of living in his community. He has enormous amounts of initiatives that have started, including the BOLD initiative, which is the Brilliant Outstanding Leader Determined to Difference program that really focuses on schools, as well as a conviction integrity unit. He has done many things to push the role of the prosecutor outside of just the prosecutor's office, but into the community. In his spare time, he is a pastor, and in his very spare time, he is also a very active father. My first conversation that I had with him, he apologized for being on speakerphone in the car with his kids, and let's just say, he has his hands full. So we are excited to have Mark here, and as our chair-elect Kim Parker said, we are recruiting him to be part of the criminal justice section because we need more prosecutors in the middle of the country that can talk about the issues that they face every day. And so we're happy to have you, Mark.
Thank you.
Beside Mark is Patricia Cummings. She essentially is the oracle of all things conviction integrity unit for the country. Patricia has practiced for over 25 years. And before she was with the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office, she was in Dallas, Texas, where she really started this whole concept of conviction integrity. And if you go through her bio, it is immense. And let me just say, from my interactions with Patricia, as well as listening to her in other presentations, I realized that she's probably about 10 times smarter than I'll ever be. She really knows her stuff. And we are so lucky that she was able to make this and be part of this whole session today. And beside her is someone that I actually have more respect for than probably anyone else in this room because he epitomizes the kind of prosecutor I want to be. And that's Kevin Curtin from Middlesex, Massachusetts. Kevin really focuses on the ethics of being a prosecutor, whether it's part of the appellate unit in his office or the work that he does with the American Bar Association. The awards that he has received are amazing. In 2017, he was Prosecutor of the Year, the Massachusetts District Attorney Association. He received the Massachusetts Bar's Access to Justice Award, and just this last November, he was the recipient of the American Bar Association Criminal Justice Section's Norm Mailing Minister of Justice Award. So we have an amazing panel that's really going to answer the questions that you have on conviction integrity units and how prosecutors can continue moving the ball as we try our hardest to advance criminal justice reform in this country. So I guess I'm going to start by asking Patricia, the oracle, if you will, what exactly are conviction integrity units, and sort of how do they start, and maybe why did they start?
Great. Thank you, Justin. Let me start with the tail end of that question and give you a little bit of the history of conviction integrity units, just in case you don't know it. There is an ongoing feud, I must say, between two units in the country. One in Santa Clara, California, likes to say that they are the first unit ever. Meanwhile, you've got the unit in Dallas who says the same thing. And like lawyers, a little bit of the difference between the two positions is splitting hairs. Santa Clara actually started their unit, but it was disbanded a short while after it was started. And then after a new elected took over, they created another unit. Dallas, on the other hand, created their unit a little bit after Santa Clara, but Dallas has been in continuous existence since 2007. I'm a little biased because I ran that unit in Dallas, so I like to say Dallas is right, not Santa Clara. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of how Dallas's unit came to be. And I think it's quite fascinating. And now that I am in Philadelphia, I kind of understand something that I didn't understand in Dallas, which is how different every unit is in the country, not only based on the communities they're in, but primarily based on the law that govern what the units can actually do. So let me back up for just a minute and tell you about Dallas. Dallas it's interesting because Dallas is not particularly a conservative place, but the history of the Dallas DA's office was not wonderful. Dallas kind of came to fame for lots of issues regarding Batson problems and how they did jury selection. In addition to that, you guys probably heard about the documentary that was made a long time ago called The Thin Blue Line. So Dallas was really kind of out there in terms of, I would say, a poster child for the need for something like a conviction integrity unit. What actually prompted the creation of the unit was that in Dallas, the appellate division actually contested requests for post-conviction DNA almost every chance they got. Now, you need to know in Texas, the statute for DNA testing post-conviction got passed in 2001. And in between 2001 and 2007, folks started paying attention to the fact that even though this new law was on the books and it really should encourage us to figure out whether or not we got it wrong in a post-conviction setting by using DNA, the Dallas prosecutors constantly said no. So there was a ton of litigation. If the trial court went along with the prosecutor, it ultimately went up to the appellate courts. Despite that contested atmosphere, what happened was, whether it was the trial court granting the DNA or the appellate court saying, trial court, you should have done it, all of a sudden DNA testing was getting done over the objection of the prosecutor and exonerations were happening. So the newly elected that took over in Dallas started scratching his head saying, this is really interesting and we ought to pay attention to what's happening and we shouldn't have let this office contest DNA testing for all the years that it did. So the elected sat down with some of his top leaders and they said, what can we do to try to change this? what can we do to try to right the wrongs that we know existed when we were opposing DNA testing for all those years. And out of that conversation came the idea of, let's put together a unit who actually goes back and looks at all of those cases where DNA had been requested, but then they never got to do it, whether it was the trial court saying no and that was the end of it, or an appellate court going along with the trial court saying no. So all of a sudden they started looking at these cases and testing them, and lo and behold, many exonerations followed. It's really important to say that Dallas, I think, was unique at this time period, not only because of the forward thinking and progressive thinking of the elected DA, but they were also so very fortunate that the lab in their jurisdiction actually hung on to all of the biological material. So it was a fertile ground for this type of experiment to go back and say, let's get the testing done. And so now, Texas, particularly Dallas, leads the nation in terms of the number of DNA exonerations. Interesting to me, by the time that I got to Dallas, we actually were reaching a point where we thought, you know, we may be running out of these cases where there's DNA to test. So what really is the work of the Conviction Integrity Unit, which was really created to deal with this DNA issue? And when I got on board, we started looking at other forensic science issues and how could you actually try to figure out if you have an actually innocent person in prison who's trying to undo what they believe is a wrongful conviction. So we kind of grew in Dallas beyond the DNA and started looking at what are the other causes for wrongful convictions and how can we do the work to try to make sure, as you were saying just a few minutes ago, Justin, that as prosecutors, our duty to do justice never ends. And so Dallas really was and continues to be at the forefront of doing that work. So that was a long way of just tackling the end of your question. So now let me kind of jump back a little bit and kind of give you some of the meat and potatoes of what a conviction integrity unit is outside the example I just gave you of Dallas. So I think it goes hand in hand with what was happening in Dallas, but we had, as a nation, we started having a conversation about what do we do with the crisis of understanding that our criminal justice system has failed and that we have put innocent people in prison. What do we do? And out of that conversation came several different options. In fact, I think probably early on, most people were terribly skeptical that you could not solve the problem within the prosecutor's office. So many people, I think, thought if you try to have a creation of a conviction integrity unit, it's sort of like having the fox guard the chicken coop. People said, well, what's the alternative? And so when the conversation was taking place in those early days, folks said, well, maybe the alternative is we just let the defense bar deal with it, or we let Innocence Projects deal with it. Then another answer to the question was, maybe what we need to do is we need to have statewide agencies that handle it. Some people said maybe the job belongs in the Attorney General's office, or maybe it belongs in an independent commission like North Carolina has. All of these options were thrown out there, and my recollection from the conversation was that the Conviction Integrity Unit option was probably the least favorite and probably the least likely one to catch on. Now, flash forward over a decade later, and I'll tell you, yes, there are some places that actually have the state agency, or as in New Jersey, this just happened recently, there is an attorney general or a state prosecutor in New Jersey that covers the entire state in regard to issues of whether or not convictions should be supported or whether or not they should be vacated. But at the end of the day, what we've seen is we've seen this incredible proliferation of conviction integrity units within a local district attorney's office. If you're interested in the topic, I invite you to take a look at the website for the National Registry of Exonerations, because they give you all of this statistical information. And what you can see on that website is a graph that tells you about when were units getting created and when did the proliferation really occur. the statistics will say that as of 2017, we had reached the number of 33 conviction integrity units throughout the country. That statistic hasn't been updated yet on that website, but as of the last couple of weeks, we are now up to 45. So I do think people understand that there may be some issues in having the prosecutors police themselves, so to speak, but right now it seems to be the best tool we have. And I will wrap up the question and my answer by saying I think the reason why it is the best tool we have so far is driven not only by the criminal justice reform movement taking place all over the country, but also because there is a recognition that a prosecutor in a prosecutor's office is going to have the most access to the information that's needed to try to figure out if and when a conviction was wrongfully obtained and whether or not it needs to be set aside.
Mark, when we were talking about preparing for this, you told me that you wanted to make sure that the why this is important question was posed. Why having conviction integrity units in prosecutors' offices is important. Maybe you can answer that for the group.
Well, I'll start out by saying that, number one, thank you for the opportunity and calling me to allow me to be here. I think the number one reason why this is important is because the criminal justice system has been around long enough for us all to learn from it. What we have found out, and Patricia, could you tell why she's the guru of all of this stuff? When I was creating ours in Kansas, I was absolutely calling and looking and studying everything she did, because when you go around and when you jump into doing this, you have to make sure that you don't fall into some of the pitfalls that are out there. The numbers, the numbers are so important. And Patricia said it, you can go and look them up, but I'll shoot off some of them. More than 2,400 people have been exonerated since 1989. 2,400 people have been exonerated. More than 21,000 years in prison has been served by folks who were at some point exonerated. That's a lot of years. In 2019, there's 42 folks who have been exonerated, okay? So for me, the why was more so about why haven't everyone else done this? Because we clearly see that our history shows that we've made mistakes and mistakes was made, and that the criminal justice system has an inherent flaw. And that inherent flaw, as in any system, are humans. We make mistakes. And because of that, we need to have something in place to deal with it and to face the reality that if we don't do something about it, then folks will have been wrongfully convicted and they will stay in jail. 1935, the Supreme Court wrote in Berger v. U.S., U.S. prosecutors are in a peculiar and very definite sense the servant of the law. But while he may strike hard blows, he is not at liberty to strike foul ones. It is as much his duty to refrain from improper methods calculated to produce a wrongful conviction as it is to use every legitimate means to bring about a just one. Our job, at least back from 1935, is to make sure that we convict the guilty while releasing the innocent. And we have seen that we have made mistakes throughout the years, and we must, one, acknowledge that, and then two, learn from it and do something about it. So for us, when I came into office, it was not something that I ran on, right? It was not something, I did not run a campaign on, hey, folks, I'm coming in as a prosecutor to get some folks out of jail. But when I probably wouldn't have made it. But I'll tell you what happened. I'll tell you what happened. I got into office focused on, yes, criminal justice reform and going and being more proactive and preventative, talking with our young people, getting in our schools, educating our folks on what you should do, what you can do, and what the perimeters are, and doing all of this. But I got in there and I received a letter from someone who was in custody and had been in custody for 24 years on a double homicide. And of course, he was saying, I didn't do it. Now, I got to tell you, I'm a former defense lawyer for about a decade, and I never, ever represented a guilty client. So when I received this letter saying that he didn't do it, it really didn't move me at all. But then when I looked back into the history of the case and found out for the previous 10 years, my predecessor refused to even acknowledge the motions that he had filed. He objected to even allowing the courts to look at it. Well, then I got upset, because if wrong is wrong and right is right, let's at least look. Well, we looked at the case and we began to do the investigation, and it was clear as day that at nothing else, this person did not get a fair trial. And then we looked further and found out that there were a lot of other evidence that was there that was never brought to the court, never brought to the judge, and the folks who we truly believe committed the crime was never even questioned. And after 24 years and sitting down with multiple witnesses, about 17 different witnesses, and as well as the defense lawyer, we absolutely believe that there was manifest injustice, and a court agreed, and this person was exonerated. It opened my eyes to a new reality. And that new reality was that procedural bars had literally been used to keep the justice system from actually looking to see if justice was served or if justice was contaminated. And so that opened my eyes to why something needed to be done, what we needed to do, at which point then I heard about the guru, and I start researching everything about what they were doing and figuring out how to establish this there in the state of Kansas. And so we're excited, and we're pushing forward, and we're moving.
So, Kevin, you've been really at the forefront on the DNA side for a long time in your practice. When you look at conviction integrity units, do you see them as going beyond this DNA sort of analysis? Are we looking at other issues? Is it just wide open? What do you think about that?
Thanks, Justin. In my office, we recently agreed to an exoneration of a person where there was no DNA evidence at all. And this was a case that arose out of the care of a police officer. And we have a system that allows police officers, indeed anybody, to seek the action of our conviction integrity unit, the attention. So in this particular case, it was a stranger rape case, really rough case, little girl taken at knife point. She makes an identification of a fellow who looks a lot like, I don't know if everybody remembers Jackson Brown. Remember the hairdo that he had? He had this hairdo where it was parted down the middle and then come down the sides of your head, long in the back. It was very popular for men in the 70s, and white men anyway. And
I'm glad you pointed that out.
True. I never was allowed to have my hair that long, so I don't know what it felt like. But anyway, so this guy was identified by the victim as the perpetrator. He was convicted. He received for this horrible case a sentence of something like 2 to 3 years, which should have raised the hue and cry right away. You know, for a judge going to impose a sentence like that for a crime like this. And so because he had a term of years, he had the opportunity to seek parole. He refused parole because he didn't do it. He wouldn't admit to being rehabilitated. So time passed, and eventually this police officer continued to be involved in the community, and he did an interview with a guy who did rapes like this at that time. And he confessed to them, but he didn't have a very strong memory of the details. So it wasn't an assertion that I committed this crime. What it was he said, "You know me, you know what I used to do. And that's about all that we had. But when you go back, the officer went back and he took a look at the at the photograph that was taken of the defendant at that time, and a photograph that was taken of the real perpetrator, we believe, at about that time. They could have been twins. I mean, it was spooky. And the hair was the thing that was really the striking thing most about it. So, it looked like she made the identification on the basis of the hair. But this was a settled conviction. The family were local. They, were very involved. And it was a big challenge for us. And it's one thing where you have unequivocal evidence of innocence. And that's one thing. But now we're starting to see the opportunity to go back and look at settled convictions on the question of actual innocence without the need for actual exoneration. So that, as Mark said, if it's clear that someone didn't get a fair trial, that would be enough for an exoneration, even if the person might very well have actually committed the offense.
Patricia, I have a question for you. You talked about this a little bit, about how the units function. We, in the previous panel, were talking about culture and how culture essentially eats everything, whether it's innovation or policy. How do prosecutors, line prosecutors that have been prosecuting cases and are out there thinking they're doing good work, how do they see conviction integrity units that are looking at their previous cases and many times finding a lot of fault in them? How have you seen buy-in? Have you seen controversy in offices? How does this work?
I will share with you guys a story about Dallas, and then I'll share with you a story about Philadelphia. Dallas, I went into the job really thinking that so much of the hard work on the culture had already been done, because the unit was in existence for 7 or 8 years before I took over running the unit. And needless to say, I was very, very naive. I went in thinking, not only that the culture had changed, but I thought that there would be great respect for the work of the Conviction Integrity Unit. Every single day I went to work in that job in Dallas, it was a battle. If I was looking at particular cases and it was necessary to talk to a prosecutor about an issue, no kidding, they would often show up in my office, I would say represented by somebody from the appellate division. I'm not so sure that they would actually say represented, but I would often ask the question, why do you feel the need to bring somebody with you? And it always led to a very awkward moment. But I think so much of that was they really felt like what we did in that unit was tantamount to internal affairs in a police department. And that was despite the fact that Dallas at that point, like I said, was probably the most successful unit in the country. So now kind of flip over and let's talk about Philadelphia for a minute. Philadelphia, it's interesting. I knew a little bit about it when I went into it, and I knew that they had had lots of troubles. In particular, the Anthony Wright case had just been big in the news. So I knew I was walking into a jurisdiction where the history was bad, but I felt quite fortunate because I was walking in, running the unit, working for Larry Krasner. And most of you guys probably know, at least at this moment in time, Larry Krasner is considered probably the most, if not one of the most progressive DAs in the country. So I knew the culture had not changed because there hadn't been the opportunity for it to change in Philadelphia. But given the fact that Larry was who he was, I figured that people would either A, get on board because they wanted to, or B, get on board because they felt like they had to if they wanted to continue to work in that office. Despite that, I have learned that it's probably as tough in Philadelphia as it was in Dallas. And I'll share with you just a little story. Yesterday, I was in court. We actually had an exoneration yesterday, and it was a pretty significant event because it involved a double homicide where there actually was a confession given by the defendant. Our investigation, however, revealed that it was a false confession. And so we had to go in front of the judge yesterday, and the judge so essentially we were doing two things. We had recommended that the convictions be vacated, and then we were saying, just vacating them is not enough. We want to make sure that the charges are dismissed because we believed, although Pennsylvania doesn't even recognize actual innocence as a standalone claim, we believe that there was no evidence and most likely the defendant was innocent. So the judge required that we had the victim's family members in court before he would make a decision as to whether or not he would dismiss the charges. And the judge not only wanted them there, but he wanted to be able to question them. So we are there in the courtroom, and it's in a homicide courtroom where a trial is actually taking place. It's a retrial, a third-time retrial in an arson case that it just kind of made me nervous and tick a little bit walking into the courtroom thinking our office was retrying an arson case a third time. But needless to say, we go up to the front of the courtroom because the judge was going to take our case out of order, and the homicide prosecutors that were in the courtroom both immediately reacted to my presence in the courtroom. The female prosecutor said right off the bat, "What are you doing here? Are you here to try to withdraw our case?" And I couldn't believe she said that. And she said it with a smile like she was joking. And my response was, boy, I guess I really do have an image problem around here. I'm going to have to work on that. But I'm not here because of your case. I am here for a completely different case. And her boss, the other homicide prosecutor, was standing right next to her. And I said something to him. I said, "What do you think? You think I've got an image problem?" And he said, "Well, Patricia, if you would just quit coming into the courtroom with handcuffs, I think you'd probably be in a better position." And I was like, what? And that's just yesterday in Philadelphia with Larry Krasner leading the office. Needless to say, what I try to tell anybody who wants to learn about this work or even wants to do it, you've got to go into it absolutely believing you are not going to be popular in the office. You've got to go into it absolutely understanding that every day is going to be a battle. And that is despite the fact that I think we have made so much progress, it is still difficult because you are seen somewhat as the enemy or a spy within the prosecutor's office. The last thing I'll say about this is oftentimes young prosecutors have asked me about it, and they've asked me similar questions to what you just asked, Justin. And I said, and I say many times, that this work reminds me of John F. Kennedy's speech back in the 60s. We're about on the 50th anniversary of when he decided we were going to put men on the moon. And in his speech, he really addressed the question of why in the world would you want to do that? Why in the world would you want to spend so much money trying to do something that may be impossible? And what John F. Kennedy said, we choose to go to the moon, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. And I really think that summarizes what we do when we try to engage in conviction integrity work in a prosecutor's office. It's hard, but it is probably the most fulfilling and most important jobs that I see in a prosecutor's office at this moment in time.
Mark, you talked about the mind shift that you experienced yourself. How do you think this mind shift and the changing role of the prosecutor is playing out? You just heard the story from Patricia from an office that's known as being progressive. How does this work?
I'll tell you, it is. It's something. It can be difficult, but it's extremely satisfying. You have to have, as Patricia said, the understanding that you're going to go in and you're going to tick some people off. We have the senior attorney who's over our conviction integrity unit. Just last week came to me, and my chief investigator, who's a retired police officer of 10 years with our local police and 20 years with the FBI, and many of the names that come up in these old cases were colleagues of his, and he made a comment to my senior attorney and investigator in the conviction integrity unit, more so to the effect of, there's no need to look into those cases because that officer was absolutely good. And so the thinking is something that you have to really understand, that a lot of people in the past have the mindset of they did not screw up, they did not make a mistake, and of course they did not intentionally do anything wrong. So with that in mind, you have to really just get past it. I wrote a little note down on the previous panel. Someone was saying that things like the pretrial changes, it takes incremental change, and I'll just do a shameless plug here, but not shameless because I'm pretty proud of being from Kansas. Our legislature just have created and passed an initiative on criminal justice reform where we are looking at pretrial detention. We're looking at diversions. We're looking at criminal justice reform in a new way and in a new light, and trying to figure out what are we doing and what can we do in a smarter way to make sure that the criminal justice system becomes more effective and more efficient and definitely more just. Well, to do that, you have to get past the politics, right? Dr. King, you can't ever do a panel without saying a Dr. King comment, and he says, there comes a time when silent becomes betrayal. Well, Mark Dupree put in a comment and says, when you're doing the right thing, you're going to make the right people mad. And they're usually the ones who are doing the wrong. You cannot sit by and just be quiet and do nothing simply because it's never been done before. When I came in and we put this into play, I had massive pushback. I mean, it was huge, not just from those that were on the prosecutorial side, but also those who were on law enforcement side. Wrote an open letter objecting to looking back at old cases, despite the history and the numbers. And the thought was we should just do this thing incrementally. Let's just randomly look at things. We don't need an entire unit to do it. I'm of the mindset that in this type of work being justice, there is no incremental change. Either we have justice for all or we don't have justice for any. And it shouldn't be, it shouldn't be that I'm more focused on keeping things the same or focused on getting back into my elected position than I am focused on bringing about the right change that we know is needed. And so once I asked for, in my county, I had to ask for the funds to do this with the commission. And I tried to be very, very limited, tried to do a very streamlined, just 3 positions. Patricia, I wasn't even asking for a lot, just 3 positions. And when I about a week out before I was to present to the commission, it's always good to be nice to people. So I found out from someone who's nice, who was on the inside of that, said, yeah, so we cut you completely out of the budget. And so I immediately had to cut my streamline request in half. I said, tell you what, give me half of that, and I'll use part-time folks, part-time this, and only 1 full-time. And then I presented that to the commission, and I had to, now politics plays a part, so I had to bring the media with me. And then I talked and I educated the community. I went out and I spoke. I think it's extremely important to understand you cannot do this work without the community support. The reason why I was not concerned about some of the folks on the commission being mad at me, or some of the folks in law enforcement being mad at me, or open letters being mad at me, because the people who put me in office, which are the folks in the community, were educated, and many of which who have been wronged by the criminal justice system or has family members who have been wronged by the criminal justice system, were 100% behind this thing, and they came out. And thus, then the commission gave me the funds that I needed to pursue this thing, and the body, hence the community, are absolutely still excited and still pushing. Now, The police union, and I know that Kevin, this is different on Kevin's hands. I think he has a little bit more police support than I do. They're watching me with tooth and nails because it's questioning things from the past, so they don't like it. But for me, it is, are we focusing on justice, or are we focusing on not making anyone mad? And the reality is, the only person in this scenario that I believe actually has the audacity to be mad is the person that is wrongfully convicted and has spent years of their lives behind bars. Beyond that, everybody else in the system needs to suck it up and move the heck on.
Absolutely.
So Kevin, on that point, you want to maybe
Sure.
Tell us a little bit about your thoughts on the mind shift?
Happy to do so. So this is a big issue, and I think the place to start is that prosecutors, and police officers, generally, I mean, we are true believers, just like criminal defense attorneys. We all are true believers. We really, really, and truly believe that we have a chance to do justice, and that what we're doing is advancing the cause of justice. But one of the things that has changed is that we now know, prosecutors and police know, that we have gotten it wrong, and that is your worst nightmare. If you really think that what you're doing is always right, you're going to have a problem. And so I wanted to actually read something that for you. I found the problem is, and this is why in the conviction integrity unit, we are in a large office that we have. None of the members of the unit working on a particular case were ever involved in the original prosecution or in the subsequent appeals, or indeed in any subsequent motions for new trial, which in Massachusetts can be filed any time. So this cynical prosecutors syndrome, and that is changing. And here's why. Excessively cohesive groups can fall prey to groupthink, a phenomenon described as encompassing illusions of invulnerability, collective rationalization, belief in the inherent morality of the group, stereotypes of our groups and other groups, and pressure on dissenters within the group. And for an unforgettable statement that exemplifies the dangers of prosecutorial groupthink, I'm going to read for you the apology of a former prosecutor, Marty Stroud, concerning the wrongful capital conviction of Glenn Ford in Caddo Parish, Louisiana. And here's what he said. And I've been involved in trial and on appeal in cases where I know that the person didn't do it. And there is nothing like that. You have to live with that. So here's what Marty said about how he was and what's changed. He said, "I was not going to commit resources to investigate what I consider to be bogus claims that we had the wrong man. My mindset was wrong and blinded me to the purpose of seeking justice rather than obtaining a conviction of a person I believed to be guilty. I didn't hide evidence. I simply didn't seriously consider that sufficient information may have been out there that could have led to a different conclusion. I did not question the unfairness of Mr. Ford having appointed counsel who had never tried a criminal jury case, much less a capital one. In 1984, I was 33 years old. I was arrogant, judgmental, narcissistic, and very full of myself. I was not," he said, "as interested in justice as I was in winning." Now, I don't know if I believe that, but that's what he said. I think that he was interested in justice. He just saw it one way. After the death verdict in the Ford trial, I went out with others and celebrated with a few rounds of drinks. That's sick. I had been entrusted with the duty to seek the death of a fellow human being, a very solemn task that certainly didn't warrant any celebration. In my rebuttal argument during the penalty phase of the trial, I mocked Mr. Ford, stating that this man wanted to stay alive so that he could be given the opportunity to prove his innocence. I continued by saying that this should be an affront to each of you jurors, for he showed no remorse, only contempt for your verdict. That's that's the thing that I think that's changed. Prosecutors, we're still true believers. Defense attorneys, we're still true believers, but it's just different because we know that there's a possibility that we might be wrong, and we're trying to find out ways to prevent that.
So I want to move on to more of the mechanics, if we could, because one of the things when we were doing our planning call that really interested me the most was that, Patricia, you said that the question that you get asked the most isn't really sort of these grandiose ideas of justice, but it's, how do I do this in my local jurisdiction, especially in a smaller jurisdiction, a more rural jurisdiction? So I found that interesting, that there is actually a lot of interest in doing this, not just in big cities, but all across the country.
Yeah, I think probably one of the most prevalent questions right now that I hear over and over again is, it all sounds great, but when you look at whether you're looking at the 33 units that existed as of 2017 or the 45 as of today, almost all of them are very big jurisdictions. So all of these other prosecutors are saying, what do I do? You know, there's 5 prosecutors in my office, or there's 10 prosecutors in my office. And quite frankly, I have to say that's always a hard question to answer. And depending on who you're talking to from a conviction integrity standpoint, you're going to get different answers. For me, I don't think my answer is pie in the sky. I think it is a practical reality of the smaller offices, and that is, I don't think that you have to have the success that you had, Mark, in getting money specifically to create a unit. I think what you can do is you can just try to change the way you do things in your office. And in particular, what I'm talking about is you should be training on issues regarding wrongful convictions. You should adopt policies that say it's okay sometimes if you've got one prosecutor assigned to do appellate work or 2, to say maybe the be-all, end-all is not just defending the conviction. There's just so much you can do to change the way the office works. Separate and apart from that mindset and the training, I think some of the smaller offices, and maybe even when you get into the mid-size offices, I think what they could also do is just reallocate resources. What we're seeing now is so many offices that are saying, let's not spend our time and resources prosecuting low-level marijuana cases. Let's not spend our time doing driving while license suspended. So if you stop doing that stuff, don't you necessarily free up some of your resources to where you could have somebody that you could devote to looking at those letters when they come into your office, and it's somebody who's been writing for 10, 20 years saying, I'm innocent, will you please just look at my case? So I think there's a lot that can be done. Of course, I think it's ideal if you can go in and you can get the money and you can set up a unit, because there's just no question that having a unit that just focuses on these issues is probably the best way to go. But I think it is absolutely the wrong message to send that it is the only way to go. I think there's plenty of opportunities to do this kind of work in a different type of setting.
So, Mark, you have one of 3 units in the state of Kansas. Is that what I think you said? There were possibly 3 jurisdictions?
Sedgwick has a conviction integrity unit, and Wyandotte County has a conviction integrity unit. I'm not sure if anyone else.
No one else. So we have 2.
Okay.
So a state of Kansas, you have a lot of rural jurisdictions, a lot of jurisdictions where there is 1 or 2 prosecutors. You've worked with other DAs in your state to share resources. Is that a possible model?
Well, I think it is a possible model to sharing those resources, to reviewing some of those cases. I'll tell you that the electeds in my state are very open to even the DAs reviewing cases for you, where you have questions. They'll take a copy of everything you got and kind of give you a unbiased viewpoint, and they're pretty candid sometimes. Hurts my little feelings sometimes. But so with that, yes, but you have to have that open mindset to be able to communicate and, and don't have the thought process of I want to hide everything that I'm doing. You have to really focus in on what your goal is, what your desire is to do. I know with the Lamont McIntyre case, which was the case that I was met with when I first came in and I spoke to you about, there was no conviction integrity unit at that time, but we still got the job done. And so Patricia is absolutely correct. There's a way to do it, but you have to first acknowledge the fact that something needs to be done. And on the mechanical aspect of it, we had to request an outside judge to come in. We had to work with the defense lawyer, right? And sometimes that's an absolute no. You don't want to sit down. It's too adversarial. You don't want to we have a complete open discovery process, especially concerning the conviction integrity units. If you have stuff that we don't have, we sit down at a conference table. You're reviewing everything we have, and I'm reviewing everything you have. My investigator is reviewing everything your investigator did, and so on and so forth, because it's about reaching justice, right? And at the end of that investigation, working collaboratively with both sides, if we believe that, yes, there is a wrongful conviction for us, then we have an outside of my office review board. One is a judge, another is a defense attorney, and then two community members who come and they sit, and then we put on a presentation and get their thoughts concerning the facts and the evidence of this case, and ultimately get their understanding on whether or not they believe that this person is innocent or not. It also gives us that transparency, one, and then two, that mindset of, okay, are you just working so hard to find a wrongful conviction that you went down the wrong road? And usually the answer is no, right? And then it's presented to me as the DA to make that ultimate decision. But we have mechanically tried to put things in place that will allow us to do the work, to change the mindset, whether we have that CIU or not. One of the procedural issues, and we found this when I got into office, not just with the cases where we're requesting review of those convictions, but also on expungements. My predecessor had a rule of thumb: you object, period. Object. And I spoke with one of the judges earlier. You just object automatically. And so you have, in Kansas, it's 60-1507 is when you're dealing with the post-conviction cases. And if we're objecting to even getting the case in front of the judge to even get a hearing, then it's usually dismissed without anything happening. And so many of these cases are never even brought to light. So the first thing we did is change that policy. That didn't take a conviction integrity unit. We don't automatically object. We review the file. We review the case. We look at it. If we think we need more time, we'll agree to an evidentiary hearing so that we can get all of this evidence and get all of this information out there. And so it's just simply making those simple changes that can bring about the right ending.
So, Kevin, I wanted to ask you a question in regards to something that Patricia brought up about training and sort of the ethics of this, and how conviction integrity units can actually help us move forward the practice of law. That we can, especially with young prosecutors, use this work that we're talking about to hopefully help them be better trial attorneys.
Absolutely. This is. I mean, what in my opinion, what prosecutors have learned in the last 30 years owes a great deal to the work of the Innocence Project, and the work that has gone into that. And we have not intentionally, I guess, or actually not through our conviction integrity unit, but sort of independently developed trainings on issues like eyewitness identification, custodial interrogations, that have been made part of our training of prosecutors and police in our county, so that now, for instance, sometimes stories are better. I never thought anybody would ever confess to something that they didn't do. I just couldn't get my head around that. Who would confess to a crime, to committing a crime, if they didn't do it? Well, I can see one person's got his hand up. It's probably because he wants to get to lunch. Yeah, whatever, anything. Let me out of here. I'll confess. But I now know that that can happen. And we now know that that actually can happen. So one of the things that we want to, at a minimum, make sure takes place is that anytime we're doing an interrogation in a place of detention, like a police station or fire station in these arson cases, those are the worst, that it's recorded. So first of all, there's no dispute about what was said. There's no dispute about how what was said was elicited. And any debate about those issues can be reviewed by looking at the tape. And it's wonderfully self-enforcing. You know, police officers, everybody wants to look good when you know you're being recorded, right? So police officers are even more courteous than, certainly you don't see the good cop, bad cop stuff on the video. I don't really see that. We have done eyewitness training as well, and this is a great benefit of an internal, or I guess the principal benefit of an internal as opposed to an external unit. Mark described, I think, what might be categorized as an external unit that includes not only prosecutors but also members from the community, maybe very experienced defense attorneys who possibly maybe they've been prosecutors in the past, maybe judges, sheriffs, police officers. And then internal units focus just on the prosecutors. And the idea is to try to create incentives for prosecutors to act ethically. And it also promotes enhanced policies on investigative and pretrial processes such as discovery, and some of the investigative procedures I've mentioned, and the creation of a mechanism for internal review of post-conviction claims of actual innocence. So we even though we don't link our training to conviction integrity, I know that that's something that is being considered and possibly implemented, I hope, in other areas. But even though we don't explicitly link our training to the lessons that we've learned in conviction integrity work, we have explicitly linked our training to the underlying work that's been done through principally the Innocence Project.
Patricia, I was wondering if you could maybe tell us what's the path forward for conviction integrity units. I know that the APA is trying to work towards a national network of the CIUs. You've been in this for a long time. What do you see as how the practice of CIUs moves forward into the future and hopefully expands?
It's interesting because we titled this panel discussion Conviction Integrity Units 201, right? Often when you have the conversation about conviction integrity units, you really are talking about how do you create one and what is one. And that conversation, as I've said early on, has been going on for the better part of a decade. I think we are now kind of hitting a place where they're not so unusual, and a lot of the basic questions for a lot of offices have been answered. So it's kind of like what's new on the horizon. And you've all heard a little bit about what's new on the horizon in the sense that one thing that I think has happened, and it is a good thing, when these units were created, originally it really was, oh my gosh, there could be somebody innocent and will DNA set them free? And John Hallway from the Quattrone Center at Penn would say that necessarily if you were looking at that kind of unit, you would define it as a unit that had a very kind of small funnel. In other words, their intake process was we were going to look at cases where there were claims of innocence and we thought that it was a colorable claim and we were going to do something about it. That funnel has widened for most of the units, whether it is because that DNA is not really the only thing that's going to get us the answer, or it's just because progressive criminal justice reform has come a long way. The funnel is now, as I said, wider, and so we are doing things like, let's not just look at folks that have a colorable claim of innocence, let's look at other wrongful conviction issues. And let's decide when we think that, my gosh, if I wouldn't prosecute that case today, why would I defend that conviction just because it happened 10 years ago? So I think fundamentally we are saying there's more for a conviction integrity unit to do. If you want to get beyond kind of that general scope issue, I think some other things we see on the horizon, which makes me believe conviction integrity units, some people call them conviction review units, they're here to stay because we're doing other things as well. One in particular is we're starting to look at sentencing issues. There's been several DA offices across the country that have said, well, you know, it's one thing to say, if I wouldn't prosecute that case today, why would I stand by it? But what about, I wouldn't put somebody in jail or prison for marijuana, but what about all these folks that we put in prison for that 10 years ago? And what about, we don't believe in the 3 strikes now, so what about all those people that are stuck doing life sentences for 3 strikes? So people are talking about that, and they're trying to figure out how to fix them. One thing that we're doing in Philadelphia that I am particularly proud of is Larry, when he said that he was going to broaden the scope of the unit, he quickly came out saying, we're going to look at sentencing. Unfortunately, I'm not so sure any of us really recognized at the time how Pennsylvania law is so restrictive and draconian, in my opinion, that there's very limited things that we can do to try to fix bad sentences in years gone by. So what we are doing, and I hope to see offices throughout the country start doing this as well, is we're starting to figure out, well, maybe we can't do it in the courtroom, but maybe we could do it with the Board of Pardons. So in particular, one thing that we're doing is my unit now deals with commutation issues. Pennsylvania it's actually one of the leading states in the country for having more inmates serving life without parole. And so those folks, a lot of them have been in 40, 50 plus years. And back at the time when they were given the sentence, there actually was hope in Pennsylvania that their sentences could be commuted. But as in many situations, there was a horrible occurrence that occurred back in the 80s or 90s where somebody was given a commuted sentence, goes out, commits multiple murders. So then the politics in Pennsylvania said, we can't do that anymore. So there haven't been many people getting commutation of life sentences. So now, as I said, my unit focuses on those cases. And unlike the way most prosecutors deal with those questions, we don't just knee-jerk say we oppose based on the facts of the offense. Instead, what we do is we do a holistic review of the entire case, and we base it on science and best practices, and we look at statistics and recidivism and how they've done in prison. And generally, if all of that looks good, we write a letter and we say we're going to support commutation. And just 2 weeks ago in Harrisburg, we actually went to the public hearing where we had supported 3 lifers. One of the cases got continued, but the other 2 got a unanimous vote to go to the governor's office. So it's going to make a difference. And I think that that is just a really good illustration of what's yet to come. And I hope more and more prosecutors kind of get on that bandwagon.
So Mark, you're an elected DA. How do you message this to other DAs to maybe look at getting on the bandwagon? And also, you talked about this a little bit, about how you had to message this to the community. How do elected DAs really explain the need for this kind of work and how it can be very beneficial to the whole system?
I think, number one, we are at this time in history, are very data-driven people. And so I think you really have to begin with the data. You have to show the mistakes. You have to show the numbers. You have to put it out there. And you have to explain that by looking at the past, you are not condemning anyone. You're simply trying to make sure that the focus stays on justice. As an elected official, the number one thing you don't ever want to do, right, is lose voters. And so when I talk to colleagues across the country, that is the biggest obstacle. And so you start by educating. And so you educate the community, you educate your voters, you make sure you educate those who are stakeholders in the community on where the flaws are in the system and how we can fix it. I lead by really pushing in the community especially when I'm dealing with law enforcement, because when you're looking at old cases, the biggest argument is you're saying that the cops did something wrong. Is that the research shows that 46% of wrongful convictions were based off of prosecutorial error. So when I talk to law enforcement, I lead with that. Hey, not talking about you guys, I'm talking about all of us, right? We screwed up somewhere. And so you have to know your audience, right? Mm-hmm. And so with that, you keep the focus on justice, where mistakes were made, have those numbers, and then you come in with the thought process of, and the community wants what's right for everyone, because nobody wants to be wrongfully convicted. The second part of what I did after we educated, then we facilitated ways to collaborate. And that was with our legislature, that was with our representatives and with our commissioners. After the release of the first exoneree in our town, legislature came on and we had a lot of conversation, and they ultimately end up passing a bill in Kansas to, for the first time ever, to allow those who were wrongfully prosecuted to receive compensation if they can receive the true innocence certificate. And so those things, you do this and you go beyond your office. It's not just about getting that conviction. Now it's about using what you learn from these processes to then create policies and laws to make sure that you do not repeat the same mistakes and that you correct the wrong. And then lastly, I kind of have to have a straight talk with them. I mean, it is not about you. It is not about you. It is about your constituents. It is about this community. Many people say, well, we're trying to restore the confidence in the justice system. Well, let me just be frank. I'm a black man in America. I never had confidence in the justice system. So you cannot try to restore something that was never there. Now, saying that, right, it's like, oh my goodness, that was just too real. Well, it's real. And you have to accept that and say, if we do not acknowledge that reality, then we can never correct or fix or make sure that we get to a place where everyone in the community, red, black, yellow, whatever, Protestant, Jew, until we accept that there's been wrongs done, then we never can get to the place where everyone feels confident that the justice system and those who are dealing with the justice system are treating everyone fair and equitably.
Kevin, we are at the close of our session. I think you'd probably agree that in the end, this whole idea is about ethical prosecution, about the pursuit of justice, not just convictions. You have been sort of a dean of the criminal justice section in the idea of ethics. What is your thought on that particular idea? Because I think it really is key to everything that we're doing, that we as prosecutors have obligations that transcend conviction.
Yes, I think that all what you said, probably I don't need to repeat, because this is what we believe. We want to do the right thing. It's reflected in the way that changes have come up with respect to this, reflected in some of the changes that we've made in our model rules of professional conduct for prosecutors and for defenders. So I think that we all want to be ethical lawyers, and this is important. This does help to build confidence in the justice system when people see that prosecutors and defenders, sure, they can get in there and fight, but if we're talking about actual innocence and what's the right thing in a particular case, that there is an opportunity for collaboration. So those things are really important and make us feel good about ourselves, make us want to go to work in the morning, make us, as we close our eyes at night, be grateful for the opportunity to serve in this way. But, it's also good business for prosecutors. One of the things that I do is I try to recruit people to come to our office and talk to students, and they really are interested in this type of work. The change in the focus of prosecutors' office to include conviction integrity, to include thinking differently about things like expungement or diversion. These are ways in which the criminal justice system is catching up with our community values. And if we want to be getting the best prosecutors that we can, same thing, for any other organization, we want to make sure that we can appeal to the best and the brightest out there. And as you know well, it's not just the brightest. It's not just being the brightest. That doesn't make you a good prosecutor.
I want to thank these three panelists because they are amazing. And thank you, everyone. We appreciate the opportunity to talk about this important issue.